So today we're covering cost centres, and this is a really large area, so we'll cover what we can. And as always, if you have any further questions, as I mentioned, or would like to discuss specific scenarios, please feel free to contact application support either by phone or email. As most of us will be aware, cost centre analysis is a big part of a business, with looking at what areas of the businesses are incurring which costs to assist with things like budget allocations, as an example. One scenario could be that a business may wish to record how many security inquiries a collections team runs as part of the recoveries process, to check on the status of a secured asset or how many credit inquiries are being run from a particular branch and the costs to the business involved with these inquiries. This was the motivation for us implementing the cost centres module in the first place. Those who are familiar with versions prior to 3.2, when cost centres was released, will know that the credentials for third-party interfaces were stored and maintained in global settings, and in some cases in user preferences. Since the rollout of cost centres, we've been progressively shifting these to the admin library cost centres, with the majority now being stored here. For those not licensed for cost centres, a global cost centre is available and mandatory. This, as mentioned, becomes the place where clients maintain their credentials and options related to any third-party interfaces that they are using. The exceptions for this being general ledger interfaces and the PPSR at the moment, which still remain in global settings at this stage. For those licensed with cost centres, they're able to have multiple cost centres, with each cost centre representing the area of the business, like a branch or unit as an example, that they wish to track calls to third-party interfaces for, allowing for reporting on costs relating specifically to that cost centre. It also, as a result, allows for different credentials to be used, optionally allowing different parts of the service options to be available and different default options to be applied at a cost centre level, which I'll show you as we go through. We'll move on now to looking at the cost centre form itself with a brief overview of the features. We simply don't have the time to go through each and every service, so I'll go through some of the things to look out for when configuring the services on your cost centre. Most of us are aware, however, for any newbies out there, when we talk about third-party interfaces or services, we're referring to the third-party companies that we can send and receive information to via an API through FinPower Connect. The credentials entered are supplied by that third-party service, and when the client signs up for that service, they provide the details and options and things that they're licensed for, generally speaking. The image here shows the current services that we interface with as at April 2022 in version 3.4.3, although Zepto is missing from this particular image. Starting with the general page, this is where you can name your cost centre and add a code as with every form in FinPower Connect. But the important thing to dwell on here is the default services that you can define. So the default services is what will appear first in the list when running one of the services available. As an example, when you launch the credit inquiry wizard, if this is the cost centre to be used, Centrix New Zealand would appear in the list first. It doesn't mean that you can't use one of the other services, but that's the one that will appear by default. It's not necessary to have these defined for everything, but there are some things that mean they will not work unless you've got a default service defined. Advanced messaging is a good example of that, because especially when sending something out automatically via a workflow or via script, it doesn't always know necessarily what service you may require, so it picks up the default one set for the cost centre it's going to use. Now looking at some of the other pages contained within the cost centre form itself. Every service, if we use Equifax New Zealand as an example, will have a credentials page and a test credentials page where relevant. Some services don't have a test platform available, so they won't have test credential options. And then the options page themselves. Now this controls all of the defaults that appear again in the relevant wizards, and whether or not this particular part of the service is able for use by this cost centre. So you can disable credit inquiries, but you may still want to be able to enable the consumer defaults on that cost centre as an example. This option here at the very top for use service defines whether or not you can use any part of this service on this cost centre. And so if you don't have the right combination ticked, it simply won't be available for use or appear in the wizard, which is something really important to note. So looking at a different cost centre, just to show you exactly how you can utilise some of these options, I've got another cost centre set up here for main branch. And if we use Centrix as an example on our options page, I've got the consumer product inquiry set for individual as the default, and they're able to access some of these other options. On cost centre 2, we have different options available. So they would be able to open the form and it'll go straight to investigative trace as an example, and different reasons, and you can set other defaults as well. If we have a look at the credit inquiry wizard, we can see if we open up Amelia, we've got Centrix popping up here first as we'd expect, and here the product is showing as consumer product inquiry. If we chose a different branch and it switches to cost centre 2, you'll see that the default product has shifted to consumer investigative trace. Again, this doesn't mean that they can't necessarily select other options, but it will default to the one that they're likely to use most, which is really handy for the overall configuration. Likewise with the services, as I mentioned, just because it defaults to Centrix doesn't mean you can't select one of the others that are available. And again, what applies here, appears here in the list, depends on what you've got set up on your cost centre with use service and what is actually enabled on each of these services. That's a really brief overview. Obviously, there's a lot of services and various options that are configurable here. 9 times out of 10 with a new service that's launched, there's a blog available or a document that goes over specific settings for these services, or like I mentioned, feel free to reach out to application support and we're happy to help you where we can. Now, this is the biggest part here of cost centres really, and that's the hierarchy. So when you have multiple cost centres, there's a certain way that FinPower Connect will determine what is used. That is in and around the basic logic here. So this is an image from our help section, which I wrote a wee while ago, that really covers off quite well how this hierarchy works, where to define your cost centres and the basic logic used. So I skipped over a little bit here that I just want to show you before we really launch into that, but as mentioned on the image on the first page, branches are a prerequisite for cost centres, and once you have the cost centres add-in, you define your specific cost centres against the branch. So as you can see here on my main branch, I've got 1, and on my southern branch here, I've got 2. Now the hierarchy means that if you don't have one defined here, or it can't find a service available, it'll move up until it finds a valid combination. We also have our global cost centre, which is attached to our entity. So if we just venture quickly to our entity form, is it? Oh, it's not actually defined here, but global by default is the highest level you can get anyway. So moving back to how our hierarchy system works. It's important to understand this logic when setting up your cost centres initially to ensure that the cost centre is recorded against the inquiry or process. First and foremost, the credentials saved for the external services that we've just covered to be accessed by the requested process must be set. So again, as I showed, you had to have valid credentials on either the test or production credentials page, depending which mode you're in. Use service must be ticked, and the cost centre is defined for use on the branch or entity. And then again, drilling down further, the account has a branch, and that's how that picks it up from there. So the basic logic is it finds a branch to use depending on what type of service you're using. So client, it'll look for a client branch, an account, and so on and so forth. Check if the branch defines a cost center. So that means, as I just showed you there, that the branch has one attached. And then if use service is ticked on that cost center. If not, as mentioned, it'll move up the hierarchy until a valid combination is found. This here is the hierarchy levels. So again, it starts with the branch. If it can't find a valid combination there, it moves up to the entity and we'll look to that cost center. If the entity has a different cost center to global, it'll look at that. And if there's nothing defined, it'll go right up to the top tier, which is your global cost center. That can be a little bit to get your head around. So also in help, we've put in a decision tree decisioning example, and this goes through one scenario of many, but it's really useful to determine which cost center should be used. Particularly when you're getting your configuration right and running through testing and you're opening up the client inquiry wizard and it's showing you which cost center is going to be used. If it reflects one that you're not expecting, I would recommend coming back to here and following through to figure out where your configuration has gone wrong. So for a credit inquiry with an existing client selected as an example, it'll go through and check if there is a branch defined on the client. If yes, it's going to look to the branch and use that cost center. If no, it's going to have a look at the branch's entity to see if it's got a cost center defined. If yes, it'll use that. No, it'll go to global, and so on and so forth. If there is no branch defined on the client, it's going to check if there's a default branch set in user preferences. Now that's really important to note, and it catches out a lot of people because they just expect where it's going to go and they forget about this little one. So I really wanted to highlight that. So if you go into your user preferences, and actually I think it's under, no, it must be under clients, general, it will look here. If there's nothing defined there, then again, it goes onwards and upwards with the hierarchy. Hopefully that makes a little bit of sense, but if not, feel free to ask us some questions. The best way to figure out how this all works is really just to have a play with it in the system. Moving along to scripting events. Those are located under the cost centers section in global settings, and this is where you'll find anything to do with overriding things like summary pages for your credit inquiry reports for all those third-party services we were talking about. And there's a few cost center options available here. I'm not code savvy, so I'm not going to go ahead and tell you exactly what you can use all of these for, but I'm sure that'll be covered off by our code guys in a later session when necessary. Moving along to finding which cost center has been attached to some of your requests, you can have a look in the audit search. If we use again our example of credit bureau requests, we move through, we can see that when you're licensed for cost centers, you can see which one has been charged, which is really useful. For those that don't know, this is also a great place to go to see why something hasn't worked for service logs. With the information here I mentioned being sent to the third-party service and what response comes back. Finally, there is some cost center reporting that is provided with the add-on under admin, and it's got the typical details and list reports that come with pretty much everything in VinPower Connect, but this one here is really useful, the cost center analysis report. You can either group it by service or by entity, but if we just have a quick look at this one here, what it will do is go through and tell you what cost centers are defined where you've got potentially nothing set at all, and where things are not enabled or not defined. So for example here on the main entity and main branch, click send, doesn't have anything defined. Again, when you're setting up your initial configuration, this can be a really useful tool to go through and see where things might be missing. So we've come to the end of the session today. It's a really big area, so it's really quite tricky to cover it off in great detail. But if you've got any questions, please feel free to come forward